Numbers don't panic, people do. Let's look at the psychology driving today's market. Capital can cluster around familiar names long before anyone proves those names deserve more weight than the overlooked alternatives beside them. We usually notice the pattern first as concentration. The same names, the same places, and the same stories keep attracting attention because they already feel legible to the crowd reviewing them. That is not automatically irrational. Some familiar assets deserve attention. The distortion appears when recognition itself starts doing work that genuine informational advantage never actually supplied across the market crowd. A repeated name can feel easier to evaluate simply because it has appeared more often. The mind experiences smoother processing, then quietly mistakes that smoothness for stronger understanding or lower uncertainty. Once that feeling spreads across many participants, the market does not need an explicit agreement. Repetition alone can make one option feel pre-approved while unfamiliar alternatives begin from a disadvantage. So the real question is not whether familiar assets are good or bad. It is why familiarity can start functioning like evidence before evidence has been compared on equal terms. In practice, the pattern looks like disproportionate capital clustering around names, markets, or regions that participants already talk about most often. Visibility and comfort begin arriving together instead of separately. Absorbers then treat that clustering as a signal of quality. The crowd says everyone keeps choosing it, so there must be a reason, even when the original reason was mere exposure. That is where the stakes rise. Capital allocation starts reflecting what the market can recognize quickly, not only what it has tested rigorously across the broader opportunity set. A familiar market summary gets opened first. A familiar company narrative gets discussed first. That sequence matters because first attention often receives the most charitable interpretation and the longest review. Repeated exposure also softens emotional friction. The known option feels less threatening, so people demand less psychological energy to keep considering it, and unfamiliar options begin carrying a hidden burden of proof. What looks like disciplined concentration can therefore contain a perceptual shortcut. The crowd may be rewarding processing ease while believing it is rewarding deeper knowledge across the market crowd. To see the mechanism clearly, separate recognition from actual insight. Knowing a name, a geography, or a sector narrative is not the same as understanding its drivers better than the alternatives. Recognition is thin. Insight is comparative. Insight asks what this option offers relative to others, what the risks are, and what evidence would still matter if the name felt completely unfamiliar. Familiarity skips part of that work. It creates a sense that less explanation is needed. The option arrives in the room already wrapped in a feeling of partial comprehension. That feeling often comes from exposure rather than analysis. People have heard the story before, seen the headline before, or watched others discuss the market before, so the option feels socially pre-validated. Mere exposure matters because repetition changes fluency. The smoother an idea feels in memory, the easier it becomes to revisit, summarize, and defend under time pressure inside collective decision-making. In committees, fluency has consequences. An option that can be explained quickly often sounds more trustworthy than an option that needs slower context, even when the slower option may be equally strong. So familiarity does not have to defeat analysis head-on. It only has to lower the friction around one choice while raising the friction around its competitors inside collective decision-making. That is why aggregate concentration can emerge gradually. Each participant may believe the choice is reasonable, yet the shared process keeps rewarding what already feels easiest to know. The loop begins with recognition. Something already known gets first attention because it feels immediately legible, and that first look increases the odds that it will shape the rest of the discussion. First attention then earns narrative support. Once the familiar option is on the table, participants find it easier to attach arguments, analogies, and historical references because the mental scaffolding already exists. Those attached explanations do not have to be false. The problem is that the familiar option receives richer storytelling partly because the audience was prepared to follow that story in the first place. As the story becomes easier to repeat, social proof strengthens it. More people can discuss it smoothly, so more people infer that the room possesses real depth rather than shared comfort. Smooth discussion then looks like informed consensus. The group begins interpreting its own conversational ease as a sign that the option has survived rigorous scrutiny inside collective decision-making. That apparent consensus attracts more capital. Allocation follows the path that now seems both better understood and socially safer to defend in front of peers or clients inside collective decision-making. Once more capital gathers there, visibility improves again. The familiar option gets more updates, more commentary, and more routine references, which feeds the next round of recognition inside collective decision-making. Notice the feedback loop. Exposure creates fluency. Fluency lowers friction. Lowered friction wins attention. Attention builds consensus, and consensus sends still more attention back to the same place. The process can keep running even when no participant explicitly says, "We are choosing this because it feels familiar." The mechanism works best when it remains unnoticed inside ordinary workflow. That is why the allocation map can drift toward the known even while everyone believes they are following neutral analysis. The process itself has tilted before the conclusion is announced. Unfamiliar opportunities face the opposite path. They need more explanation, more reassurance, and more translation, so they enter the room already paying a psychological cost that the familiar option never pays. That extra burden does not mean the unfamiliar option is superior. It means the comparison started asymmetrically because one side was granted easier access to patience, airtime, and provisional trust. Over time, the crowd mistakes the resulting concentration for discovery. Capital piles into the familiar, then points to that existing pile as proof that the concentration must have been earned. At that stage, the market is not only reflecting analysis, it is also reflecting the social convenience of choosing what already felt easier to defend, summarize, and revisit. So the core mechanism is not that people love comfort in the abstract. It is that comfort quietly changes the procedural path through which collective capital gets assigned and justified. A structural counterpoint matters here. Familiar assets can genuinely offer better disclosure access, stronger local knowledge, or practical monitoring advantages that unfamiliar options do not provide to every participant. That means concentration is not automatically a familiarity error. Sometimes the crowd really does possess better information, stronger legal access, or more relevant context around the familiar choice. There is also a rational exception. If a team can actually observe management, regulation, currency risk, or local behavior more directly, familiarity may coincide with real analytic advantage rather than mere comfort. The limitation is that the two forces often mix together. Genuine access and mere exposure can arrive in the same package, which makes the bias difficult to isolate cleanly in real time. Another boundary is structural. Mandates, liquidity, benchmark design, and institutional constraints can also narrow the opportunity set. So psychology explains part of the pattern rather than the whole landscape. That matters because overclaiming would miss the profile's point. Crowd psychology can contribute to concentration, yet it does not erase market structure, incentives, or practical information asymmetries. The mechanism therefore does not prove that any familiar market is overpriced or any unfamiliar one is better. It explains how comfort can bend attention before explicit valuation arguments take over. Now we can answer the opening tension. Capital clusters around familiar names partly because familiarity can masquerade as understanding, giving some options an easier route through collective review. The crowd does not need to be lazy or reckless for that to happen. It only needs to confuse repeated exposure with lower uncertainty often enough for the process to compound. That is why a familiar choice can win support even when the decisive edge never becomes fully explicit. The room experiences the option as safer to handle before proving it is safer to own. The key claim is narrower than familiar equals bad. The real claim is that comfort can substitute for comparative effort, and collective allocation can then mistake ease for insight. Once many participants do that simultaneously, capital concentration becomes a social outcome. The market overweights what feels easiest to recognize and underweights what requires slower translation into shared confidence. That pattern persists because every round of visibility strengthens the next one. The familiar option earns more attention partly because it already received more attention in the previous round. The loop weakens only when the process slows down enough to compare comfort against actual edge. Equal scrutiny matters because familiarity thrives most when the comparison remains procedurally uneven. So the resolution is simple. Familiarity can be a real convenience, yet it can also become a hidden allocation shortcut when repeated exposure starts carrying more weight than verified advantage. The observation framework is practical. When a market or name feels obviously safer, ask whether the safety comes from better evidence or from the crowd's longer, smoother history with that story. Ask what the familiar option received that a less familiar option never received. Did it get more patience or more forgiving interpretation simply because everyone already knew the story? Ask what would happen if the same facts arrived wrapped in an unfamiliar label. Would the room still grant the same confidence, or would it suddenly demand more proof and slower justification? Ask whether the neglected alternative was rejected by evidence or by friction. Those are not the same outcome, even though they can produce the same final allocation on paper. Observe the process, not only the destination. The ordering of attention, the ease of narration, and the social comfort around one option often reveal more than the final vote itself. Separate repeated recognition from actual informational access. A crowd can know a story well, repeat it smoothly, and still possess only a shallow comparative case for overweighting it. The point is not to reverse the bias mechanically. The point is to notice when familiarity is doing hidden persuasive work that the room is mislabeling as deeper understanding. The point is not to reverse the bias mechanically. The point is to notice when familiarity is doing hidden persuasive work that the room mislabels as deeper understanding. Behavioral interpretation does not tell you what to buy, sell, or avoid. It asks whether the market's confidence came from stronger evidence or from a more comfortable route through collective judgment. The point is not to reject the familiar automatically. The point is to ask whether comfort earned its authority through evidence or merely through repetition. Don't follow the herd. Study it. See you next time.